He stood beneath the Arc de Triomphe, built to immortalize his glory, but he never saw it finished. He crossed the Alps with fire in his veins, yet spent his last years arguing with shadows on a cold island. He conquered kingdoms, but never silence. The greatest tactician of his age, undone not by an enemy, but by the voice he couldn't shut out, his own. He's remembered as a military genius, a self-made emperor, a man who bent Europe to his will. But what if the story of Napoleon Bonaparte isn't about triumph? What if it's about compulsion? About a boy born to be forgotten, who carved his name into history not because he believed he belonged, but because he feared he didn't. He was a master strategist, yes, but he was also a master illusionist, hiding his deepest insecurities beneath layers of legend, medals, and myth. His victories were real, but so were the voices in his head. The shame, the inferiority, the unbearable silence after applause fades. The world saw a titan rise, but beneath the laurels, there was always a frightened Corsican child, desperate to prove he mattered, and he never stopped running from that child, not even when he crowned himself emperor. This isn't just a story about power, it's a story about identity, fractured, fragile, and fiercely denied. A story where ambition wasn't a virtue, it was an escape route, where the battlefield became a mirror, and eventually a cage. So the question isn't, how did Napoleon rise so far? The question is, what was he running from, and why could he never stop? Was his genius real, or was it the most elaborate performance in European history, staged for an audience of one? This isn't a lesson, it's a descent into one of history's most brilliant minds and its most haunted. Napoleon Bonaparte was not Parisian, not royal, not tall, not well-connected, he was Corsican. Born on a battered island still mourning its independence, surrounded by whispers of resistance and pride that clung to the stone walls like sea salt. To the French, he was foreign. To Corsicans, he was a traitor. His family had aligned with France to survive. He belonged to neither world. At school in mainland France, the isolation deepened. He spoke with a thick Corsican accent, mocked by classmates, looked down on by noble-born boys who had centuries of legacy behind their names. They called him the Little Corporal, not with affection, but with mockery. He learned early. To be heard, he had to speak louder. To be seen, he had to rise higher. To matter, he had to win. Humiliation became the foundation of his ambition. Where other boys played, Napoleon read military theory. Where others sought friendship, he sought discipline. He wasn't building a future. He was armoring himself against the past. And beneath every calculated command, there was a frightened child, still trying to erase the sound of laughter in a cold academy hallway. This is the psychological wound that would define his life. Not glory, not empire, but a war against invisibility. And the world? The world was tearing itself apart. Post-revolutionary France was a vacuum of blood, power, and paranoia. The monarchy had fallen, heads rolled in the name of liberty, while opportunists scrambled for control in the chaos. Power was up for grabs, and it wasn't offered, it was taken. Imagine a nation with no center, no king, no compass, only fear, hunger, and the roar of crowds. The old world had died screaming. The new world hadn't yet been born. This was the crucible Napoleon stepped into. A boy from the margins, entering a world where identity was malleable, power was fragile, and the right timing could turn a nobody into a legend. France didn't need a king, it needed a sword. Napoleon offered both. But what made him dangerous wasn't just his intellect. It was how deeply he understood instability, because he'd been born into it. He didn't fear chaos, he recognized it. He could ride it, because it had always been his home. But before the battlefield came the betrayal. His father, Napoleon Bonaparte, had once been a fiery Corsican patriot, but bowed to the French for protection, securing a minor noble title in exchange for submission. Napoleon never forgave him for that. He saw it not as pragmatism, but as surrender. The first lesson in what it meant to lose your name to survive. His father's death when Napoleon was just 15 left the family in financial ruin, and left young Bonaparte furious, ambitious, and alone. He vowed not only to restore the family's honor, but to rewrite their history. That was the moment it began. Not a quest for France, not even a quest for empire, a quest for redemption, for control over the story. Because for Napoleon, legacy was not about truth, it was about narrative. And he would rather die mythologized than live dismissed. By 16, Napoleon was already writing political essays, arguing that Corsica should be free. By 19, he was leading troops under the revolutionary banner. But even then, his gaze wasn't on France. It was on the silence inside himself. He didn't want to serve. He wanted to command. He didn't want to lead France into the future. He wanted to escape his past and drag France with him. And power, he would learn, wasn't just protection. It was proof. Proof he was no longer the outsider. Proof he could not be ignored. Proof that the little corporal, the foreigner, the mocked boy, had become untouchable. But what happens when proof is never enough? He was not born to rule. He was born to prove he belonged. And that would shape every war, every lie, every crown. Victory didn't just come to Napoleon. He carved it out of chaos. By his mid-20s, the Corsican outsider had transformed into France's most electrifying general. Italy fell into his hands like a ripe fruit, not by sheer force, but by precision. He wasn't reckless, he was surgical. Where other commanders hesitated, he moved. Fast, clean, unrelenting. Victories at Lodi and Arcole weren't just military wins, they were psychological pivot points. His soldiers didn't just obey him, they believed in him. He made them feel seen. He remembered names. He shared bread. He walked through mud beside them. But beneath the triumphs, something quieter was forming. Addiction. Not to violence, but to validation. He fed on praise like oxygen. Each battle was a mirror, and in every victory he glimpsed the man he wanted to become. Not the boy from Corsica, mocked for his accent, but the man the world cheered for. In Paris, the people began whispering his name like it was prophecy. Pamphlets praised him. Artists painted him with Roman laurels. He leaned into it. He didn't just win wars. He won minds. He understood image. He crafted it like a weapon. Posing in marble halls, hand tucked into his uniform, not to rest his arm, but to remind the world, I control the frame. He returned from Egypt not just with tales of conquest, but with a legend. The Republic was bleeding from within. Factions, failures, fatigue, and Napoleon offered certainty. In 1799 he seized power in a bloodless coup. The Directory fell. The consulate rose. He was no longer a general. He was France. And for a moment, it worked. Roads were paved. Schools were founded. Laws were rewritten into the Napoleonic Code. The economy stabilized. He brought order. But beneath that order, something festered. The applause never echoed loud enough. The throne was too still. The silence too sharp. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, not out of necessity but out of message. The Pope reached to bless him, and Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head. A symbol. A rupture. A statement to the world and to himself. No one gives me power, I take it. But with the crown came the mirror, and with the mirror came doubt. He grew restless, suspicious. What once had been a mission to save France blurred into obsession. He controlled the press, censored opposition. Surveillance grew, letters were intercepted, dissenters disappeared. He eliminated rivals with the cold precision of a surgeon, or a man afraid of ghosts, and the ghosts were everywhere. In Josephine he saw both comfort and betrayal. She had once saved him, stood by him, but she could not give him what he wanted most, a dynasty. Her womb became a battlefield too. In 1810, he divorced her. The woman who had once steadied his mind was replaced with a younger empress, a Habsburg princess. The marriage was political, strategic, loveless. In the palace, smiles became knives. His siblings, once tools of his ascent, became burdens. He gave them crowns, in Spain, in Naples, in Westphalia, but they bickered, betrayed, and failed. He called them incompetent, but what he really saw was his own legacy slipping. And so he reached outward. Again, more campaigns, more control. He redrew maps as if geography were a chessboard. But the further he stretched, the more the ground cracked beneath him. He was no longer fighting for France. He was fighting to silence the fear that without constant movement, he'd vanish. Russia. 1812. The decision was bold, deliberate, catastrophic. Advisors warned him. The terrain was vast, the supply lines thin, the Tsar elusive. But Napoleon didn't listen, couldn't listen. Every warning felt like an insult, every caution, a shadow of humiliation. So he pushed forward. Over 600,000 men marched eastward, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Not just an invasion, a statement. But Russia did not fight, it waited. The land burned behind the retreating enemy. Cities were abandoned, food was destroyed. And when Napoleon finally reached Moscow, it was empty. The silence was unbearable. And then, the city ignited, not in welcome, but in flames. The smoke that rose above Moscow wasn't just literal, it was psychological. It marked the beginning of the collapse, not just of the campaign, but of Napoleon's delusion. He waited weeks in that ghost city, hoping for peace. None came. Winter did. By the time he ordered the retreat, the Grande Armée had begun to rot, from frost, starvation, and despair. They came as lions. They left as bones in the snow. Napoleon abandoned them, rode ahead, returned to Paris to control the narrative, to convince the people it was a strategic redeployment. But the mask had slipped. Josephine was gone. His son, a fragile heir, cried in a gilded crib. His allies had turned wary. His enemies, emboldened. He tried to rebuild, to rally, to spin loss into strength. But the silence after Moscow still echoed in his mind. He once believed he could shape the world. But now, the world was shaping him into something colder, smaller, more afraid. He didn't just lose soldiers in Russia. He lost the part of himself that believed he was invincible. He had conquered kings, redrawn borders, crowned himself godlike. But in the end, it wasn't a foreign enemy that undid Napoleon. It was the lie he told himself, that if the world feared him, he would never have to fear himself. The first frost of the Russian steppe didn't come with a roar. It crept in silence, a silence that gnawed at the morale of an army once unstoppable. Horses fell before bullets. Men froze mid-march, clutching their uniforms like broken dolls. And still, Napoleon marched east. He had crossed half the continent on the strength of belief alone, his belief in destiny, in control, in his own myth. But destiny, unlike maps, doesn't bend to ego. And in the smoking ruins of Moscow, with no Tsar to surrender and no glory to grasp, denial was the only weapon left. Napoleon entered Moscow not as a conqueror, but as a man chasing shadows. The city had been emptied and torched by its own citizens, scorched earth as both defiance and warning. Still, he lingered. Days turned into weeks, waiting for a peace offer that would never come. His generals pleaded, supplies dwindled. But the emperor, the man who had made kings kneel, refused to retreat, because to retreat wasn't just military failure. It was psychic collapse. It would mean the world was no longer bendable to his will. And so winter answered the silence. With snow like ash and air sharp as glass, his Grande Armée, once the largest force assembled in European history, dissolved into a graveyard stretching 600,000 bodies long. This wasn't strategy. It was self-destruction disguised as destiny. He didn't lose to Russia. He lost to reality and refused to admit it. By the time he returned from exile in Elba, there was still enough fire left in him to rally France one last time. For a moment, the old confidence returned. The crowds, the speeches, the horses galloping through spring fields as if history itself were reversing. But something had changed. His instincts, once surgical, now felt blunted by years of command without correction. He no longer listened. Not to subordinates, not to signs, not to himself. And so at Waterloo, with his enemies united and the ground literally soaked by days of rain, Napoleon gambled everything. He delayed, misread, underestimated, and then watched, from a lonely ridge, as the myth unraveled before his eyes. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological reckoning. He could no longer escape the truth. He was no longer the man the world, or he, believed he was. In the mud of Waterloo, his brilliance drowned beneath the weight of his illusions. They sent him to St. Helena, a wind-beaten rock in the middle of the Atlantic, as far from power as a man could be. The house he lived in leaked, the meals were Spartan, the guards never left him alone. And so he picked up a pen. In exile, Napoleon did something remarkable. He began to rewrite. In memoirs dictated to loyalists, he cast himself not as a tyrant, but as a martyr, a misunderstood hero betrayed by cowardly monarchs and cruel fate. He edited his defeats, inflated his virtues, framed his empire not as a conquest of ego, but as a mission of civilization. And here lies the twist. One final psychological fracture. We don't know if he was lying to the world, or if by then he believed every word. Because that's the danger of living inside your own myth. Eventually, the mask fuses with the man. The island didn't cage him, the story did. Napoleon had spent his life escaping one truth, that he was not enough, not noble enough, not French enough, not accepted enough. And so he chased eternity, empire, legacy, monuments carved into time, all to silence a voice from his childhood whispering, "You don't belong." But power cannot heal identity. Conquest cannot cure shame. And when the applause fades, all that remains is the man you tried to forget. He ruled millions, yet couldn't rule the wound inside himself. His fall wasn't a single moment. It was an unraveling decades in the making, seated in humiliation, watered by ambition, and crowned in delusion. But before we say goodbye to Napoleon, we must ask one final question. Did he fall? Or did he disappear into the story he told to survive? Because if history is memory at scale, then Napoleon Bonaparte, in exile, became his own last battlefield. A man not fighting the world, but fighting for the last word. On the island of St. Helena, the wind never stopped. It howled through the shutters, seeped through the cracks in the stone, rattled the rusted hinges of a world that no longer listened to him. Gone were the drums of armies and the cheers of crowds. Now there were only creaking floors, the slow scratch of quill on parchment, and the sound of a man trying to rewrite his own history. Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile, far from France, far from glory, his body failing, his legend already fermenting into myth. But death didn't bring silence. If anything, it amplified his voice. Because even as his body weakened, his pen grew sharper. He dictated, revised, embellished. He blamed others. He framed himself as the eternal victim of monarchs and cowards, of fate and misfortune. And just maybe, he believed it. But what do we make of that? In life, Napoleon built an empire. In death, he built something more enduring, a narrative. One that has been used to justify ambition, to glorify nationalism, to celebrate genius, and to excuse tyranny. His legacy is everywhere. In textbooks and statues, in military academies and political speeches, in revolutionaries and dictators alike. And yet, beneath the marble and metals lies something far more human. A boy from Corsica who never felt he belonged. A man who rose to command empires, yet was forever chasing a sense of worth. A genius who could bend battlefields to his will, but never mastered the battlefield within. His strength and downfall were one and the same. A desperate need to be seen. Napoleon's life is a study in contradiction. He gave Europe a civil code and left it soaked in blood. He crowned himself emperor and died powerless. He was adored and abandoned. He believed himself immortal, and yet was haunted by the memory of being forgotten. He rose because he needed to prove he mattered. He fell because he could never accept that he already did. This is the tragedy at the heart of so many driven lives. The idea that enough is never enough. That identity must be earned, carved into stone, conquered from doubt. But if you build your self-worth on conquest, then peace feels like failure. Napoleon is not just a man of the 19th century. He's a mirror held up to our own time. In a world obsessed with legacy, performance, and control, where power is prized and insecurity buried beneath bravado, what could be more modern than a man who mistook dominance for healing? How many of our leaders today are still chasing ghosts of humiliation? How often do we mistake confidence for clarity and myth for truth? We speak of Napoleon as a historical figure, but what if he's also a psychological type? The outsider who overcompensates, the visionary who cannot rest, the conqueror who never felt loved. They buried him far from France. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe, now reduced to a tomb on a remote island, surrounded by windswept grass and the faint echo of cannons long silenced. But maybe the real burial happened years earlier, the day he stopped listening. To advisors, to family, to himself. Because once you become a myth, you're no longer allowed to grow. Napoleon Bonaparte ruled nations, rewrote laws, and redefined power. But his deepest struggle, the one that outlived every war, was never with kings or coalitions. It was with the self he could not accept. He ruled millions, but never escaped the prison of his own mind. He died far from the lands he once ruled, on a wind-swept island in the Atlantic, surrounded not by armies or courtiers, but by a shrinking circle of loyalists and an ever-growing sense of irrelevance. The man who had crowned himself emperor, who had redrawn the map of Europe by sheer force of will, spent his final years writing, or more accurately, rewriting, dictating memoirs, shaping a myth, not for France, not for history, but for himself. In exile on St. Helena, Napoleon became his own most devoted biographer. He told tales of destiny, of betrayal, of misunderstood genius. He minimized defeats. He reimagined disasters as near victories. He spoke of his rule as enlightened, inevitable, necessary. And slowly, with each retelling, the line between memory and myth blurred. The man who once bent Europe to his will now bent the truth to his need. The story had to live, because without the story, what was left? He was no longer ruling an empire. He was ruling a narrative. Yet even in that isolation, surrounded by loyal scribes and fading portraits, his insecurities never left him. The same wound, the fear of being small, unwanted, forgotten, still throbbed beneath the layers of legend he wrapped around himself. Power had not healed him. Victory had not silenced the voice that whispered, "You are not enough." When he died in 1821, it was not with thunder, but with a quiet, lingering decay. His last words, allegedly, were France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. A prayer to the things he lost, the people he used, the love he destroyed. An echo, not a triumph. And yet he endured. Statues were raised, streets were named. His silhouette, that unmistakable hat and coat, became a brand. His enemies had tried to bury him, but he became larger in death than in life. Because people didn't just remember Napoleon the man, they remembered Napoleon the idea. He had become a symbol of ambition, of genius, of delusion, of the tragic, magnetic pull of a life driven not by clarity, but by denial. Because that is his true legacy, not the legal codes or battlefield tactics, not even the reshaping of Europe. His legacy is the cautionary tale of what happens when a man cannot tell the difference between who he is and who he needs to be in order to feel whole. Napoleon ruled millions, but he never escaped the prison of his own mind, and in that sense, his story isn't just historical, it's human, uncomfortably, enduringly human. Subscribe, please.